Imagine, a 9-year-old native girl, her hair still wet from baptism, stands alone in the flickering light of a mission chapel. Latin prayers echo. The priest smiles. He opens a door in the back. She enters. The door closes. We never describe what happens inside. The screen fades to black. They called it salvation, but for thousands of native girls, baptism was only the beginning of what was never meant to be remembered. They told the parents it was mercy, that their daughter would learn to read, wear clean clothes, and walk with grace, that she would be safe inside those high white walls, away from the wildness of the forest, the fire of her mother's chants, the old gods, and the dirt she was born on. They promised protection, discipline, salvation. But the moment she passed through the gates of the mission, none of that was true. What stood waiting behind the stone arches of the California missions wasn't a house of worship. It was a machine designed to tear her away from everything that made her who she was: language, memory, family, tribe, and rebuild her into something they could control. She was 9, sometimes 8, sometimes 7. They took her when she was old enough to understand she was being taken, but too young to fight back. And once the gate shut behind her, she disappeared. For more stories like this video and subscribe to our channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I find it incredible that we learn about history together from all around the world. Between 1769 and the mid-1800s, the Spanish Crown and the Catholic Church established over 20 missions along what is now the state of California, and hundreds more throughout New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. On the surface, they looked like churches: grand adobe walls, towering crosses, open courtyards where priests walked in silence with hands, Ds folded in prayer. But this was not prayer. This was conquest by another name. The Spanish had already claimed the land. Now they would claim the people, and they would begin with the children. The mission system was the perfect instrument of control, funded by the Crown, enforced by military garrisons, and sanctified by the Church. And behind every sermon, every rosary, every whispered benediction was one ultimate goal: erase the Indian. Not with guns, but with baptismal water and Latin chants, with shaved heads and locked doors, especially the girls. Girls were considered the most vulnerable to so-called moral corruption, so the priests made sure they were always watched, always confined. They were placed in monjeríos, sealed dormitories, often windowless, sometimes built without doors. The only way in or out was under the eye of the mission priest. Some monjeríos held 30 or 40 girls, ages ranging from 5 to 14. The girls slept on straw mats, if there were any. They washed with cold water, if any was left. They were rarely allowed outside except to work, and even then they were flanked by guards, mission soldiers with muskets slung over their backs and whips curled at their sides. They were told their bodies were holy, but every day they were treated like prisoners. The justification: to protect their purity, to keep them from being seduced by native boys, or worse, from reverting to heathen ways. But behind the holy excuse was something far more sinister. The girls weren't being protected, they were being isolated for access. Historical records from Mission San Gabriel, San Juan Capistrano, and Santa Clara show it clearly. Missionaries kept detailed registers: who was baptized, who was married, who died. What they didn't record were the nights, the crying, the priests who entered the monjeríos after prayers ended, the soldiers who chose girls for labor and never returned them before dawn. One report written by Father Mariano Payeras praised the monjerío system because the girls could be watched at all times, day and night. He called it discipline. But what kind of discipline involves locking little girls in windowless rooms with no contact, no voice, and no defense? The priests believed they were doing God's work, turning wild children into civilized Christians. But the tools of that transformation were fear, starvation, confinement, and control. Girls who spoke their language were whipped. Girls who sang old songs were forced to kneel in ash and pray for forgiveness. Girls who cried were accused of weakness. And those who resisted, they disappeared. Some were sent to serve in the priest's residence. Others were claimed by soldiers under marriage licenses that often bore no signatures. Marriage in this system didn't require consent, only ownership. There are records of weddings between Spanish soldiers in their 40s and native girls who were 11. There were pregnancies in the mission books, marked without names, without fathers, just delivered female, baptized. The names of the girls themselves, when listed, were Christian names only. No tribal identity, no family lineage, only property of the church. And always beneath it, silence. Some tried to escape. One girl, no more than 12, slipped out through a latrine tunnel and ran toward the mountains. She was caught 3 days later, barefoot, bleeding, starved, and returned to the mission. The records say she was corrected by penance, but they don't say how. Others tried to resist more quietly, refusing to eat, refusing to speak, retreating into themselves. Some succeeded, others died. The priests often blamed Indian laziness for the deaths, but girls were dying from untreated infections, starvation, abuse, exhaustion. Their graves still lick beneath church courtyards and stone corridors where tourists now walk. No names, just numbers, just the marks of bodies never meant to leave. This system was not accidental. It was designed, engineered. The crown wanted land, the church wanted souls, and native children, especially girls, were seen as the raw material of empire. Take them young, baptize them, control them, breed them if necessary, and above all, make sure they never remember who they were before they entered the mission walls. That is why they were taken so young. Not to protect them, but to break them, before their memories could solidify, before their spirits could resist. And once they were broken, once their language was gone, their names erased, their family ties severed, they could be remade, as wives, as servants, as symbols of the church's victory over the so-called savage. But the victory was a lie, and the salvation was never for them. It was for the priests, for the colonizers, for the empire that fed off their obedience and silence. Because these girls weren't just caught in history, they were devoured by it. And what came next, after the confinement, after the renaming, after the prayers and the penance, would be even darker, because baptism was only the beginning. She was held by the shoulders, wet hair clung to her cheeks, a priest's fingers pressed into her skull. His breath hovered just above her skin as he whispered the sacred words in a language she did not understand. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. The water poured over her head, and just like that, she was no longer who she had been. Her name, given to her by her mother, spoken in her language, sung in her cradle, was erased. She would never hear it again. Not here, not in the mission. She had been baptized, but what they called salvation was the beginning of her disappearance. For native children taken into the Catholic mission system, it didn't matter if they resisted, it didn't matter if they cried, if they begged for their mother, if they screamed as the water touched their scalp. Once baptized, they belonged to the church, forever. And the church never gave them back. With baptism came a new name, a Christian name, a European name, usually chosen by the priest, sometimes after saints, sometimes after royalty, sometimes after no one at all. Her birth name, spoken for generations in her tribe, was replaced by Maria, Isabel, Katerina. Names she couldn't pronounce, names she didn't choose, names that sounded like the ones whispered by the men who locked the dormitory at night. To the church, this was a necessary purification. To the girl, it was a form of death. In a single ritual, she lost her identity, her lineage, and her spiritual connection to her people. And if she ever spoke her real name again, she was beaten. If she spoke her language, she was punished. If she told the others who she was before the baptism, she was silenced. The priests didn't just erase names, they erased memory. The goal of the mission system was not just to convert, it was to reprogram. They believed native people were blank slates, wild and ignorant, waiting to be rewritten with Spanish values and Christian doctrine. But they weren't blank, they were full of story, full of culture, full of sacred knowledge passed down through the blood. And that's exactly why the church wanted it gone. So they began at the root, with the child, with her name. Records from missions across California show this clearly. At Mission San Fernando, a child listed as Zolene was baptized and renamed Maria Soledad. At San Luis Rey, an 8-year-old named Cuella became Ana Magdalena. In the books, nothing remained of who they had been, not their tribe, and not their parents, not even their original age. Baptism turned them from human beings into religious inventory. Once renamed, they were classified as neophytes, new Christians legally bound to the mission. They could not leave, they could not say no. They were no longer viewed as native children, but as souls in process, raw material for the church to shape. For the girls, the psychological impact was devastating. Many didn't understand what had happened. They only knew that the moment the water touched them, everything changed. They were suddenly treated as property. They were forbidden to visit family members. They were told to pray day and night in a language that made no sense. They were told their ancestors were demons, that their old gods were false, that their dreams were evil. Even their own thoughts were now suspect, because after baptism their minds were no longer private. They belonged to the priests. Confession was forced, sometimes daily. Girls were instructed to report every impure thought, every doubt, every slip into memory. If they failed to confess, God would see. If they confessed too much, punishment would follow. And sometimes, confession became something else entirely. The same priests who baptized them would sit across from them in the dark, alone, and ask what they thought about at night, who they dreamed of, what they felt in their bodies. Some girls said nothing, others tried to speak, and those who did were marked as dangerous, possessed, rebellious, corrupted. They were separated, beaten, or taken to be corrected. The psychological trauma of forced baptism was generational. Girls raised inside the mission system began to believe the lies. They believed they were UNC, lean. They believed their parents were savages. They believed their body was a curse, and that obedience was the only path to safety. By the age of 12, many no longer re-me. This was not faith, this was spiritual colonization. The church used baptism as a tool to erase culture, erase resistance, and erase testimony. Because once a girl was baptized, her voice no longer mattered. If she spoke of abuse, it was dismissed as hysteria. If she cried, it was considered a sin of pride. If she refused to follow orders, she was said to be in league with the devil. Her very identity became the weapon used against her. She wasn't just a child anymore, she was a project. And when she stopped being useful, she was disposable. Some of the girls tried to fight back. A few remembered their names, whispered them to each other at night, kept them alive like a secret ember beneath ash. Some made tiny carvings under the beds, symbols from their tribes, birds and suns and hands. Others held the memory in their blood, silent but burning. But most of them never got the chance, because for many girls, baptism was followed by something else. Something darker, something that had nothing to do with God. What began at the font often ended in the back room. They told her she was chosen. The priest had spoken her name, the new one he gave her, and smiled. He told her she was special, that God saw goodness in her, that obedience was purity, that he would be proud of her. So if she followed him to the back room, she obeyed because she was 9, because he wore a robe and held a cross, because they had already taken everything else. And when the door closed behind her, she didn't scream, because she knew no one would come. For years, native girls inside the mission system vanished behind closed doors, and no one asked why. It began with the spiritual authority the priests claimed. They alone could baptize, they alone could grant confession, give orders, decide who was clean and who was sinful. And with that unchecked power came something far more sinister: access. In every mission, there were spaces not open to the public, rooms inside the church, quarters near the sanctuary, isolated chambers attached to the back of monjeríos. No windows, no witnesses, no questions. They called them offices, confessionals, storage. But the girls knew what they were. Everyone knew. They were the rooms where the silence lived. Historical records from Mission San Gabriel, San Juan Bautista, and Santa Clara make this pattern disturbingly clear. In the official mission documents, young girls were listed as servants or domestic aides in the priest's residence. Some were as young as 9 years old. They were assigned to specific padres for laundry, sweeping, or food preparation. But these records don't explain why they were often kept overnight, why they were moved away from the dormitories, why other girls whispered about them the next morning, and then said nothing else. In many missions, a priest's favor became a death sentence for childhood. Girls were praised for obedience, for being quiet, for looking away. But in private, that praise became proximity. Proximity became touch. Touch became trauma. There were no parents to protect them, no tribal elders, no legal advocates. The church was the law, and the priest was the embodiment of God. If a girl resisted, she was beaten. If she cried, she was blamed. If she ran, she was hunted down and corrected. Mission logs occasionally mention disciplinary measures for wayward girls or rebellious neophytes. But what they don't say is what happened to make them rebel in the first place. Some girls refused to return to the priest's quarters. Others tried to hurt themselves. Some stopped speaking altogether. The records called this spiritual resistance, but in truth, it was survival, a final defense against the U. Spanish and Mexican soldiers were garrisoned nearby, and they often claimed native girls as part of their reward for service. Technically, this was called marriage, but the average age of these brides was between 10 and 13. The average age of the men was often over 30. Consent was irrelevant. Marriage was just a transaction, a way to make rape look legal. There are documented cases where priests arranged these unions, even blessed them, to maintain good relations with the local military. A girl could be locked in a monjerio one night and handed over to a soldier the next. Pregnant by 12, dead by 15. At Mission San Luis Obispo, Father José Cavaler arranged a marriage between a 12-year-old baptized girl and a Spanish cavalryman. The girl died in childbirth a year later. Her body was buried in the mission courtyard. No mention of her tribe, no name, just wife of Alonso. This was not an exception, this was the system. But the darkest truths were never written down. They were passed in whispers, in the way older girls avoided eye contact, in the way younger girls clutched their blankets at night, in the way some girls never returned from the back room at all. Survivors later described it not just as rape, but as a ritualized violation, sanctified by robes and incense in God's name. They were told, "This is what it means to be pure. This is how we cleanse the soul. This is how you prove your loyalty." And if they spoke out, if they ever dared to tell another priest or soldier what had happened, they were punished for tempting the man of God. Some were beaten in front of others, some were excommunicated, others were sent to isolation, where they stopped speaking altogether. Many of these priests were later praised for their charity and discipline. Some were oted, some were honored, some were canonized as saints. They wore their titles like armor, immune to justice. Because no one believed native girls, they were seen as animals, savage children, liars, and heathens. The word of a priest, a man of God, was worth more than an entire tribe. So the stories died in silence, and yet they survived. In fragments, in descendants, in testimonies passed down through generations in hushed tones and broken sobs. A granddaughter remembers her grandmother's limp. A mother tells her child never to trust men in robes. A woman grows up knowing nothing of her great-aunt, only that she was sent to the mission and never came back. This was not a story of isolated monsters. It was a system, designed to erase, designed to dominate, designed to use young girls as spiritual offerings to power, because once a girl had been baptized, renamed, and stripped of her family, she had no protector. Her body became an open space for conquest, and what happened behind closed doors was buried beneath centuries of prayers and marble. But it did happen, and the pain did not vanish. It passed through blood, memory, and silence. And for many, what came after the violation was no less cruel, because the church didn't just use their bodies, they used their wombs. They were not meant to survive, they were meant to reproduce. Once a native girl was baptized, renamed, broken into obedience, the next phase began. She was no longer just a student or a servant. She became something else, something the mission system considered more useful than a soul, a womb. Behind the walls of the Spanish missions, especially in the late 1700s and early 1800s, Nancy was not just common among native girls, it was expected. It was even encouraged, as long as the father was the right kind of man. That man was usually not native, to pacify and assimilate native peoples by creating a new race, a mixed race. They called it mestizaje, the blending of native blood with Spanish blood to produce children who could be raised as civilized Christians under the empire. But this was not cultural integration, it was genetic conquest, a slow-motion genocide by reproduction. The process began with access. Once a girl had been baptized, she was no longer considered indigenous under Spanish law. She was now a Christian neophyte, and legally available for arranged marriage, service, or childbearing. Priests claimed it was their duty to marry these girls off to protect their virtue. But in many cases, these marriages were orchestrated between girls as young as 11 or 12 and Spanish soldiers in their 30s or 40s. There was no courtship, no consent, just signatures, usually the priests, sometimes the soldiers, rarely the girls. In the archives of Mission San Luis Rey, there's a record from 1803. A 12-year-old girl named Maria Feliciana was married to a Spanish settler who was 39. Within the year, she was pregnant. 2 years later, she was dead. In Mission San Gabriel, over 24 girls between the ages of 10 and 14 were listed as married in a single decade, nearly all of them to men more than double their age. No mention of the circumstances, no mention of abuse, just birth records, and then death records. Some girls never saw marriage at all. They were simply taken, impregnated by soldiers, priests, or laborers, sometimes with promises of protection, sometimes with threats. There are no official numbers, but historians estimate that hundreds of native girls gave birth in the missions before the age of 15. Many of them gave birth alone. Some of them died during childbirth. Most were not allowed to keep the child, because the child, that was the real objective. A mestizo child was proof that the system worked, proof that savagery could be erased, that the native race could be bred out, not with guns but with wombs. And so these girls were used. Not once, not by accident, but as part of a conscious institutional process to create a future that no longer included them. The Spanish crown even offered incentives for these unions. Mestizo children were sometimes given better rations, lighter labor, even positions of status in the colonial administration, as long as they were obedient, as long as they rejected their native heritage, as long as they remained grateful. For the mothers, there was no reward, no healing, just shame. Because once the child was born, it often wasn't hers anymore. Many infants were immediately baptized and taken into the church's custody, raised in the mission school system, taught to speak Spanish, taught to pray in Latin, taught to look at their mother not as a parent, but as a symbol of what they were supposed to grow beyond. Some girls never saw their child again after birth. Others were forced to nurse them for weeks before the child was removed, and when the child cried for their mother later in life, they were told, "She was only a savage girl. God gave you a better family." This cycle repeated over generations. Mestizo children raised in missions. Mestizo girls baptized and married off before puberty. Mestizo boys sent to labor or service. Meanwhile, the full-blooded native women who birthed them vanished from the records. Sometimes they died. Sometimes they ran. Sometimes they were sterilized, told it was for their health. And sometimes they simply stopped speaking because they had no name, no child, no tribe, nothing. It erased tens of thousands of matrilineal bloodlines. It turned girls into incubators, mothers into ghosts, and made the church into a machine, not of mercy, but of biological erasure. This was not about saving souls. This was about remaking the population, using indigenous women to produce children who would no longer be considered indigenous, using rape, forced marriage, and religious law to breed out resistance and replace it with silence. By the mid-1800s, the mission system began to collapse, but the damage had been done. Entire generations of native women had been used and discarded. Entire bloodlines had been diluted, renamed, or disappeared. And as the United States took control of the West, it adopted the same strategy, but with new tools. Because where the church had used baptism and forced childbirth, America would use sterilization. They said it was for her health. She was 14. She had never been told what a uterus was. A nurse smiled as she pushed the girl into the examination room. The doctor never asked permission. He simply held the scalpel and said nothing. She woke up groggy, bleeding, empty. They said it was a routine procedure, but when she asked if she could still have children, the nurse just turned and walked away. She would only learn the truth years later. She had been sterilized, not because she was sick, but because she was native. By the 20th century, the Spanish mission system had crumbled. The crosses were cracking, the adobe walls were crumbling, but the war against native women continued, just with different weapons. The United States government had taken over the land, the courts, the clinics, and soon it would take the wombs. From the early 1900s through the 1970s, the US government, in collaboration with state institutio, ENS and public health authorities, carried out one of the most quiet and devastating eugenics programs in modern history. Its target, Native American women, especially the poor, especially the young, especially those who had already been abused. They called it population control. They said they were preventing poverty, disease, and dependency. But what they were really doing was this. They were deciding who was allowed to have children and who wasn't. Poor. It began in the Indian Health Service, a federal program tasked with providing medical care to native communities. It was underfunded, understaffed, unregulated. In the 1960s and 70s, native women began reporting something strange. They would visit IHS hospitals for minor surgeries, appendicitis, tonsils, birth control, and they would leave unable to have children. No warnings, no explanations, no follow-up care. The sterilizations were performed through hysterectomies or tubal ligations, often during unrelated procedures. Doctors didn't ask, they simply did it, because they believed they had the right. Some women were told if they didn't consent to sterilization, they'd lose their welfare checks. Others were told their children would be taken away. Some were simply lied to, told it was reversible or necessary to save their lives. Girls as young as 11 were targeted. Women who didn't speak English were coerced into signing forms they couldn't read. Others weren't even told anything at all. One woman, just 18 years old, went into an IHS clinic for abdominal pain. She woke up sterile. When she asked the doctor what happened, he told her, "You have enough kids already. Be grateful." He had none. A 1976 investigation by the US Government Accountability Office revealed the truth. Between 1973 and 1976, the Indian Health Service had sterilized over 3,400. Some reservations reported that up to 40% of their women of childbearing age had been sterilized during this period. Not because they were criminals, not because they were sick, but because they were seen as a threat to America's racial future. No, this wasn't just medical abuse, it was biological warfare. The same logic that justified baptizing native girls to erase their culture, the same logic that bred them with soldiers to dilute their race, was now cutting them open and removing their ability to bear children. Forever. It was no longer enough to use native women. Now they had to be stopped. And this wasn't isolated. It wasn't one rogue doctor or a handful of nurses. It was institutional, funded by federal money, justified by policy, and carried out in clinics across the country, from South Dakota to Arizona, from Oklahoma to Alaska. Doctors were often praised for efficiency. Hospitals received more funding for hitting population targets. No one was punished. No one was held accountable. And the women, they were told to forget. But how do you forget being emptied? How do you forget the moment you realize you will never carry life again? Not because of fate, not because of nature, but because someone decided your bloodline should end. How do you erase the pain of being told, in sterile fluorescent light, you were a risk to society, we fixed you? For many women, the trauma lived in silence for decades. Some didn't speak of it at all, not even to their children. Others couldn't have children to tell. The pain sat in their bones, in their dreams, in the way they watched other mothers nurse their babies and turned away. In some tribal communities, entire generations of women were cut off from the ability to continue their lineage, bloodlines, that had survived disease, conquest, and forced conversion, were ended in air-conditioned hallways with rubber gloves and clipboards. The daughters of the mission system were now the mothers of nothing. This was not an accident. It was a continuation of the belief that native women did not deserve agency, that their bodies were not sacred but utilitarian, that they could be baptized, impregnated, discarded, or cut. Whichever method worked best to ensure the empire grew, but they did not. And perhaps worst of all, most Americans never even heard about it. There were no front-page stories, no trials, no national apologies, just quiet trauma passed down in whispers, a different kind of silence, but no less violent than the one behind the mission walls. And yet, some women did speak. Some stood up, they named names, they sued the government, they demanded hearings, they wrote books, they told their daughters, so they could tell the world. But even then, they were called liars, told it was all a misunderstanding, that no one would do such a thing on purpose. They were denied justice, again and again and again, because this was never just about one era, or one priest, or one doctor. It was a war, a slow, deliberate, methodical war, on native womanhood itself. And even when the cutting stopped, the silence did not. She tried to speak, her voice trembled, but she said it anyway. What the priest had done, what the doctor had done, what the government had taken. The room went quiet. Then came the answer. That never happened. You must be confused. Where's the evidence? And just like that, they gave their pain to the public, hoping someone, anyone, would listen. In the 1990s, several native elders began to speak publicly about what happened inside the missions. They described rooms with locked doors, priests who smelled of wine, nurses who said nothing as they were wheeled into surgery. They remembered the feeling of losing their name, their child, their ability to carry another. But for every woman who spoke, there was a crowd waiting to bury her story. Historians, clergy, politicians, archivists, even well-meaning academics. They demanded documentation. They dismissed oral history. They called the memories unreliable. They asked, why are you bringing up the past? But the past wasn't past. It was still inside them, in their blood, in the way they touched their own daughters' faces with shaking hands, in the way they never let their children go near churches or hospitals or certain kinds of men. The trauma wasn't a memory, it was a presence. Some of the most respected figures in American Catholicism actively resisted these stories. When mission abuse survivors demanded church accountability, the response was often legal deflection, or worse, saint-making. Junipero Serra, the founder of the California missions, the same man who oversaw the system of forced conversions, corporal punishment, and total isolation, was canonized a Catholic saint in 2015. While native women protested in the streets, holding signs with the names of their stolen ancestors, the Vatican praised Serra for his devotion. One elder said, "It felt like watching the man who burned your house down get rewarded with a mansion." There were documents, there were birth records, death logs, disciplinary orders, but the most damning details were never written down. They lived in the spaces between, the missing names, the unnamed fathers, the teenage mothers buried with no cause listed, the girls marked as married at age 11, the complete silence about what happened in the back rooms. What was left was not a lack of evidence, it was the design of erasure. And even when Native women took their cases to court, when they sued hospitals, clinics, and federal agencies for sterilization, they were met with disbelief. The US Government Accountability Office confirmed that women were sterilized without consent. It confirmed that the Indian Health Service had failed to follow proper procedure. It confirmed that thousands had been violated. But no one was punished. No reparations were paid. No convictions. No headlines. Just another report filed in an archive. Just another woman told, yes, it happened, but it's over now. Move on. But how do you move on when your daughter is gone? When your body was used as a battlefield? When your truth is treated like noise? How do you move on when the system that hurt you now demands your silence? You don't. You fight. And they did. Women like Deborah Miranda began to write, not fiction, but history. She exposed the monjeríos as rape chambers. She documented the lives of girls erased by baptism. She told her grandmother's story, her great-grandmother's story, and her own. Other women held ceremonies, dug up graves, sang the old songs, lit candles for children whose names never appeared in mission books. They wrote essays, they created resistance art, they lobbied for public acknowledgements of what the Chew Arch had done. And slowly, the silence cracked. But the backlash came hard. Church leaders accused them of attacking faith. Historians claimed the records didn't. They were accusing God, accusing empire, accusing America. They were pointing at the cathedral and saying, that man raped me. That nurse sterilized me. That system tried to erase me. And for a society that worships power, there's nothing more dangerous than a woman who remembers. But they didn't stop. They published books. They taught in schools. They raised their grandchildren with names that had been buried for centuries. They refused to baptize their children. They refused to let history sanitize their pain. They refused to let silence win. And still, many were met with cruelty, dismissal, mockery, exclusion, because the truth is, this country was built on forgetting them. And yet, they endured. They found each other, across tribes, across nations, across languages. They formed survivor networks, cultural revival programs, legal funds, truth-telling movements. They didn't just survive, they remembered, and they forced the world to remember too, not because it brings justice, not because it brings healing, but because some stories cannot be buried forever. And no matter how hard the church tries to canonize the monsters, no matter how many names are left off the plaques and monuments, no matter how many girls were never heard from again, the silence has a sound, and one day, beware, the world will have to listen. She had no tombstone, no photograph, no written name. She was baptized, renamed, violated, and buried, not in a churchyard, but in history's blind spot. Forgotten by design, erased by purpose, but still, she speaks. Not in words, but in blood. For every native girl taken behind the backroom door, for every mother sterilized without her consent, for every child born from us. Conquest then vanished from the records. There was something they could never take. The blood remembered, the body may have been broken, the name may have been changed, the child may have been stolen. But deep beneath the trauma, the grief, the bone and memory, something survived. A whisper, a rhythm, a knowledge too ancient to be burned out by books or priests or scalpels. Today there are women who feel pain they cannot explain, a sorrow that feels older than their own life, a grief passed down like a scar beneath the skin. Some don't know why they're afraid of white buildings, why the sound of church bells makes their stomach twist, why the word obedience feels like a chain wrapped around their throat. Some don't know where their grandmother came from, or why she never spoke her language, or why there are no photographs of the women before her. But their bodies remember, because trauma travels, and when history is silenced, the blood becomes the archive. In recent years, a new generation has begun to dig deeper, not for gold, not for fame, but for truth. They're unearthing mission records, hidden journals, oral testimonies once dismissed by scholars. They're identifying the burial grounds behind the chapels. They're finding the graves of little girls marked only with numbers and giving them names again. They're tracing the survivors' descendants through DNA, matching them to lineages they were told had died out centuries ago. And what they're finding is devastating, but also sacred, because buried under centuries of lies is something alive. Every Native woman who speaks her truth today, whether in a classroom, a courtroom, or a poem, is performing resurrection. Every child given a name in their tribal tongue, every story shared across generations, the moment she gave birth and refused to forget the child they took. Resistance in silence. Resistance in song. Resistance in survival. Not all the women in this story survived. Most did not. Some were buried in mass graves behind the missions. Some died during childbirth, never recorded. Some lived for decades but never spoke again. Their silence was not weakness, it was survival. And yet, even in silence, they left something behind. A seed, a spark, a pulse. And now the silence is ending. Museums are being pressured to return stolen remains. Churches are being forced to reckon with their saints. Governments are being called to account for what they cut, what they sterilized, what they tried to breed out. And on reservations, in classrooms, on stages and screens, Native women are speaking, not as victims, but as survivors, as descendants, as truth-tellers. They are the daughters of women who were never meant to live, and they are still here. Duan, this is not closure, there is no such thing. You don't close the door on genocide. You don't turn the page on rape and erasure and pretend it's history. What you do is remember, and speak, and refuse to look away, because if you're hearing this now, you are part of the memory. You are a witness. You now know that girls were baptized and taken, that wombs were used as weapons, that silence was enforced, that truth was buried. And knowing this, you carry a piece of their resistance too. Her name may not be written, but her blood still speaks, and now, so do you.